The time has come for me to attempt the daunting task of trying to replace one of my favorite songs. This feels like from the get-go a lose-lose situation. I am so nostalgically tied to this track that no matter what I write, it will feel bad instead of different. Tracks like these come with the added difficulty of struggling to overcome a bias you have against your own taste. It's almost like it doesn't really matter what gets written. I could write the most beautiful piece of music the world has ever heard. As if. And it'll always be a downgrade in my ears. There are a couple of tracks like this in Final Fantasy I. This theme, titled Chaos Shrine, is a track that gets played in two different locations. The first is, well, in the Chaos Shrine of the present. For most playthroughs, this music will be heard here twice. Once when you enter to fight Garland, and again when you enter to go to the past version of Chaos Shrine, a theme which, coincidentally, is probably my favorite track in the entire game. The other location that this track gets played at is in the Sunken Shrine. This in itself is super confusing because when you choose to listen to Sunken Shrine, it actually plays the Chaos Shrine past music. This is what I alluded to at the end of the last video. I kinda want to get an actual answer as to why these tracks were named this way, but I wouldn't be surprised if the answer to this is lost to time and subsequent releases of the updated soundtrack is just kept static for posterity. Let's have a listen to the original. Very early into the process of conceptualizing what I wanted to do, there was a technical question that I feared I already knew the answer to. I may butcher this explanation, but here goes. Once I finish, the plan is to create a mod for the Pixel Remaster so that the music I'm writing can be experienced by anyone in their own playthroughs. A very good friend of mine has been kind enough, and smart enough mind you, to attempt to delve into how this process works. With the understanding that I have, whenever the player enters a particular location, a trigger happens. Whether that be a doorway, a screen transition, an increasing danger number for encounters, the trigger causes many things from scene transitions to music changes to story progression. Because we don't have the source code for the game, we can only interact minimally with these triggers. Fortunately, referenced media such as sprites and fonts and yes, even audio can be changed. This doesn't require looking at the game's code, because that isn't available, but rather changing what is referenced by these triggers. If an event you trigger walking into town causes an audio file called village.ogg to start playing, we can replace that audio with whatever we want to as long as it's called village.ogg. While this process seems to be simple enough, the current difficulties as I understand it lie with what exactly you can do with those triggers. For example, I spoke in the town video about how I do not like the shop and end music to interrupt the theme of the town. As it turns out, you can totally replace all of those audio files with town music, but it restarts the theme every time you enter one of those buildings, completely ruining the point of not including the original music in the first place. It breaks immersion. How does this affect this track? Before I knew the information I just spouted off, I planned to create a new track to keep the two locations thematically different. With what I currently know, or am able to understand of what was explained to me, the audio file that these triggers reference is the same. If you have the Chaos Shrine event happen, it says play shrinemusic_01.ogg. When you go to the Sunken Shrine, it also calls for that exact same song name to start playing. This wouldn't be such a big deal, but if you try to remove the media that the shop or inn trigger references, it crashes the game. Therefore, I'm led to believe that the exact number of audio files must match what the original unaltered game has in order for the thing to actually boot. Yes, all of this was just to tell you that I can't write two separate tracks. I have to write one for two very different locations. And my goodness, sorry to any game devs having to listen to my scuffed explanation. If you happen to know the solution to these problems, though, please leave a comment about it. So instead of being able to really hone in on what I want to evoke in just the Chaos Shrine, I have to think about what I want to evoke in the Sunken Shrine as well. What do I feel when I hear the original? I actually had to sit on this one for a little bit. I don't know if at the time of writing I feel less in tune with hearing emotions, but the word that came to me was quaint. I know this isn't an emotion per se, but it is really all I could come up with. I knew before I started that I wanted to somehow factor in the feelings I have about Jack Garland from Strangers of Paradise into this track. I won't get into the weeds on the story, but there are a couple of small spoilers about Stranger of Paradise in general, so if you care about that, this is your warning. The Garland we're sent to dispatch in FF1 is actually the hero of the entire story of FF1. We happen to also be heroes, but it was Jack that lets us play that role. His sacrifice of becoming a prisoner to near infinite time is one of the most brutal sacrifices I can imagine. I want the theme you hear when you walk into the Chaos Shrine to feel different than what you have heard this far into the game in both texture and atmosphere. I don't want you to feel like you're walking into an evil lair to vanquish a foe. I want to try and force a feeling of weight and of sadness and sorrow to pay respect to Jack. If you haven't experienced Strangers of Paradise, I want that specific feeling toward the character replaced with the feeling of utter melancholy. If you're a first-time player, I want you to be sad without knowing what you need to be sad about. I want it to be contrasting to the point of confusion for new players. These kinds of songs are in a territory that I'm comfortable with, but this isn't the only location that this music will play in. When you enter the Sunken Shrine, you take a barrel underwater and a small little snippet shows you in some sort of underwater, shrine. As anyone who has played Donkey Kong Country can tell you, water music just has this bar you have to reach as far as quality and texture goes. I think it's a fair statement to say that music for water levels in games all have a very distinct sound that properly separates them from the rest of the music in the game. How do I do both? That question has caused the most struggle of any track to date. I know I spoke about the opening movie potentially being the most difficult track due to the timing needed to recreate it, but this is a whole separate monster with a specific problem of its own. How do I create that melancholy I desire while also creating a sound that fits into the water theme? I started on Monday. I hit some notes that sounded like this. And I was pleased. Once again, within moments, I had a series of notes to build off of for this. If only. I believe this is the key of C-sharp natural minor, and it feels so unfamiliar. It doesn't help that I don't have any idea of what particular sound I want to use, so I'm hearing a piano play what a piano should not be playing when compared to the sound in my head. I was unhappy with the progress I made on the actual melody, but maybe Tuesday will be better. It wasn't. I spent around 5 more hours attempting to write a melody and harmony that worked together. I got several different variations made, but they all felt separate from one another, and I couldn't make them connect. Either way, progress is progress, right? It is, but when Wednesday rolled around, it was pretty clear that I had a block of some sort. Whether it was unfamiliarity with the key or any other number of things, I ended the evening with several hours of more effort and only a feeling that I had gone backwards, with the exception of a single thing. I had found the sound I heard in my head. I had the texture. What I didn't have was any patterns that went together. I didn't have a good harmony to go with any of the melodies. I didn't know what other instruments I needed to use to complement this sound. Thankfully, my writing block was guard broken by brute force on Thursday, and I ended up with instruments and a structure that I liked. On Friday, I was able to clean it up to a place where we are at this very moment. Let's finally get into it. The first thing that got written was an Anion staple, the first harmony. I spoke in a previous video of my tendencies to write harmonies for harmonies, and this is a really good example of that kind of work. For the instrument, after a ton of struggle in finding the right thing, I settled on a metallophone. When you also put some Valhalla Supermassive onto it and we play said first harmony, this is what that sounds like. I initially played with this series of notes in a higher octave, but found that with them where they are, the missing upper registers immediately hit me with something that sounded similar to being underwater. The reason is probably just because the higher frequencies are absent, and if you put a high-cut filter on anything, it will sound like it's underwater. The next thing written was a melody to go with that harmony. I moved this into a higher octave, and despite also being a metallophone, the way that the sounds work together makes my brain feel like how a dog probably does when you scratch him in just the right spot. The vision I had for this track was purely in atmosphere, and not in how interesting something may sound. Similar to the Victory Fanfare. It needed to make you feel a certain way above all else, and this thought process persisted in this track. As far as structure goes, I'm seeking 4 patterns of the original harmony. Each measure progresses by adding a new instrument or sound to the mix to help ease the strain on someone's ears if they get lost in the sunken shrine for too long. At the end of these 4 patterns, I added in what I'm choosing to call a break, a segment that is half as long as the preceding music, but serves the purpose of resetting the song so that it doesn't feel like it's in a constant state of progression. If the previous 4 patterns were progressive in nature, then these 2 are regressive in nature. This is what that segment sounds like. It was pretty easy to decide that there would be no brass in this track. So flutes and rubber chickens were added as part of the progressive elements in repeat 3 and 4 respectively. This is fine and all, but this is where a ton of unexpected struggle came in. Stringed instruments typically fit well with everything, so I figured where I needed high strings I'd use violins, and where I needed lower strings I'd use cellos. I ran into a few issues mostly tied to the strange key, but after a bit of adjusting, I felt like I was in a place where strings were complementary with the sounds I already had. Here's that regression segment with the violins added. And here's what the first part of progressive sounds like with the cellos. Cool. It works, and sounds good. But there was something missing. Thankfully, earlier in the week I had purchased the literal exact thing I needed. I don't want to dramatize this or anything, but this was the night and day difference that really took me from being in the dumps of feeling inadequate to finally recognizing that this is exactly what the doctor ordered. Sometimes when you think you want to add some pizzazz, you end up with a pizzaster. I made this joke on stream earlier in the week and there was no way that I was going to let that pun vanish from my memory, but here is just the first bar with this pizzazz added. And since the verboseness of my fingers is going to already cause strife with my voice, and then all of the words and such I'll need to make appear on screen in this video, here is the full track played with that little extra context from the overworld. Whenever I'm working on a track, it gets played in my car as a general test every speaker you can thing. I'm gonna be honest, and not because I'm looking for sympathy, but because I'm trying to send a message. I haven't had an especially good past 48 hours or so. Pretty bad even. These days were filled with internal thoughts of what ifs and I should haves, and all sorts of questions you ask yourself about things you fear you may regret. I've been experiencing feelings of loss and knowing what once was will never be again. I've been feeling barely describable sadness and anguish about things I've never had to confront to this degree. Every time I've gotten in my car to go anywhere these past 2 days, I put this song on and I feel it matches my mood and thoughts, but in a peaceful way. I don't know if it's just happenstance, but I hope that should any of you be going through anything in life, that maybe this track gives a little bit of peace like it did for me. At risk of continuing to sound like I'm scratching my own back, it's also important to know that when you have creative difficulties, it's easy for frustrations to mount up because you aren't living up to your expectations or performing up to your standards. And that's okay. Nobody's 100% of the time. Just keep at it, and the things within yourself that are getting in the way of you doing what you want to do will eventually fall apart. Maybe. I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist or anything. As always, your thoughts, both positive and negative, are always welcome and very appreciated. I know this video is a little heavier than my previous, and I apologize. I'll return to form soon. If anything you saw here was interesting or entertaining to you, please consider subscribing for the next video where I tackle the mini-boss battle theme. Thanks again, and see you soon.